Hi there. There are many recent books about the origins of the Special Air Service. Writers like Ben McIntyre, Gavin Mortimer, Damien Lewis have quite recently all written about the story of how the SAS was created in the desert. And each of these writers puts a slightly different emphasis on who gets the major credit for this. And so in this review of Speed, Aggression and Surprise by Tom Petch, we'll go over his version, which he puts forth quite a bit of evidence for, of who really deserves the credit. Now, I think all the writers agree that Dudley Clark was the spark that really ignited the SAS. But in many previous works, his career is sort of mentioned, but or his contribution is mentioned, but not really his career gone into detail. Whereas the present book, it certainly does. Tom Petch, the author, has a military background and in fact served in 2 SAS as a troop commander. So he has really credibility and knowledge in this area. Dudley Clark was one of those chaps who, by their own reckoning, was unfortunate in being too young for the First World War and too old for the Second World War. He joined the Royal Artillery in 1916, fully expecting to go to war. He didn't, but then in 1917 he joined the Royal Flying Corps and became a qualified pilot. And his flying took in places like Kurdistan, Mesopotamia. He worked briefly with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and many other places. In the interwar years, he worked in Africa and also in Cairo, and he got involved in intelligence operations in Turkey, which had a big influence on his subsequent career. So when the war started, he became the Second World War started, he became deeply involved in the Norwegian campaign, quite a disastrous campaign. And his experience of combat made him really a sought-after consultant later on in the war. Following the Norwegian campaign, he crystallized some of his ideas into the creation of the commandos. And there's no doubt that it was him who came up with the concept and also the name, commandos. And he was instrumental in setting up the Special Training Centre, Loch Aylort, with Bill Sterling as chief instructor. Back in the Middle East, he became intrigued by the uses that deception could be put to. And one of the things he came up with was to convince the Germans, particularly Rommel, that there were airborne forces opposing him. And at the time, the name for the airborne forces back in the UK was 11th Special Air Service. So he took that as the name of his notional airborne unit in the Middle East, in Egypt. And he first created K Detachment of the SAS, which was setting up dummy vehicles and dummy aircraft and doing deceptive parachute drops, dropping dummies by parachute. He then set up L Detachment, which became what is now known as the SAS. Now, Clark's motivation in having this as a deception operation is very, very clearly shown by the fact that right in the early days of L Detachment, when they were training at Cabrit, he brought a film unit out and filmed them doing unarmed combat, doing the famous rolls off the back of trucks to simulate or to get them ready for parachute landing. And this film was shown widely back home in the UK and also to the troops in various Allied cinemas. So knowing that the Germans would pick up on it and they'd be convinced of this parachute force. But in the event, David Sterling and others ran with the idea and convinced the powers that be that this was a good idea. Of course, we know they started off with parachute training, and the first operation they did was disastrously wrong, and there was just a small core of survivors who managed to keep the idea going. There was some opposition to them, but they did have the ear of some very senior officers, and Dudley Clark was always pushing their case as well. Now, I will mention that the contribution of the Long Range Desert Group was immense at this time. Following the initial work of Major Bagnold, the LRDG had been operating for some time and had amassed a great deal of experience, modification to vehicles, rations, navigation aids, desert survival, and SOPs for contact with aircraft and so on, use of camouflage, relationships with the indigenous people. All of this was already in this existing unit, and some of the raids they carried out were very much the kind of thing that the SAS would be doing later. And one SAS officer, Bill Fraser, who we'll mention a little bit more in this review, was sent with the Long Range Desert Group as an advance party, and he was impressed by their SOPs and by how they operated. And there's no doubt at all that this influenced the SAS, because without the Long Range Desert Group at first to be their means of transport into target areas and extraction from them, they wouldn't have been able to operate anyway. And then later on, they had enough vehicles of their own and had gained the expertise mainly from the Long Range Desert Group. And a few Long Range Desert Group personnel did cross to the SAS as well. Now, I mentioned Bill Fraser, and out of all the personalities in the SAS story, Tom Petch has singled out Bill Fraser for a special prominence. He joined the Gordon Highlanders as a private soldier and was eventually commissioned, and was a very, very successful soldier. He joined the commandos, as quite a few of the guys from the Scottish regiments did, and then joined the SAS from the commandos, again, as many others did. And there's no doubt about it, he was a major figure in the SAS at that time. So this book does kind of tell his story in rather more detail than some of the others. He was involved in many of the major operations, led some of them, and was an influence on the operations. In contrast, the book kind of downplays some of the other characters. Sterling, some of his mistakes are acknowledged, some of his contribution is acknowledged, but he is not really given the prominence that he has been in some other books. And Paddy Mayne, I've come to the conclusion that Tom Petch really didn't think a lot of him. And in my mind, Paddy Mayne was the towering figure, according to, if you have read all of the books and all of the accounts, you can only come to that conclusion. But the current book does tend to concentrate on his problems, his drinking, his brawling, which did happen. But when you put it against his record, even before he joined the SAS, he was a terrific warrior. He was born to fight. And within the SAS, he led many of the operations, destroyed lots and lots of aircraft, as we know, and eventually led the SAS. And to a great extent made it what it was. But the book harps upon brawling, drinking, and homophobia. Now, I think that's very, very unfair, because the term homophobia was unknown back then, because really it was the default attitude of most people, because homosexuality was illegal at the time, and most heterosexual people did not really have a great deal of time for the idea of homosexuality. So our modern attitudes since the war and since the 60s, when homosexuality was legalized, obviously are a lot different to what it was back then. And to single out one chap as being homophobic, when, as I say, the majority of people, and you can just see this by the kind of things that were on TV in the 50s and 60s, I think that was unfair. One of the operations that the SAS undertook, Operation Bigamy, which was one of the raids on Benghazi that they tried, and it was a sabotage operation with the idea of sinking a lot of ships, was disastrous. One of the main reasons that it failed was a series of OPSEC violations, operational security. The OPSEC was pathetic. One chap walked into an unlocked office and found the operational plan lying open on a desk. It was talked about in the hotels and bars quite openly, which were nests of spies. Cairo was an absolute hotbed of espionage, where people were selling secrets to all comers, and it was totally insecure. Now, during World War II, there were posters everywhere: "The walls have ears," "Loose lips sink ships," "Be like dad, keep mum." So it was known that you shouldn't talk about sensitive subjects in public areas, but everyone and his dog knew the Benghazi raid was imminent, and so when it came off, it was a disaster, heavy loss of life. The Luftwaffe destroyed 70 vehicles during the withdrawal, and really the SAS could have faced disbandment at that time, but by that time they had the ear of Churchill. Randolph Churchill was a friend of Sterling, had been on operations, and he gave them a glowing report, and they were saved, luckily and thankfully. But a lot of the initial operations went badly wrong. Another major character who receives very, very little mention in the book is Bill Sterling, David's elder brother, who has been credited with a lot of the initial ideas and a lot of the support for the SAS, and eventually was one of the regimental commanders, and put his own career on the line to make sure that it wasn't used incorrectly. So unfortunately the book doesn't really give him the credit I think he should get either. An episode Dudley Clark was well known for in most of the books was he went on a secret mission to Madrid, an intelligence mission, and was arrested by Spanish police dressed as a woman. And he had another set of women's clothes in his luggage. He came up with some story about it, but the clothes undoubtedly fitted him because the shoes were size 12. And he faced disgrace. He was recalled, but in the event nothing happened. The book doesn't really elaborate much on that, about his motives for doing this. He was involved in amateur theatrics before the war, and there's photos of him dressed as a woman in some of that. It just might be that kind of thing he was interested in. But he was walking around on a secret mission, which you might think was highly indiscreet. After the war, he tried to get his memoirs published about all the stuff he'd been up to, blocked by the War Office. So he wrote some thrillers, some novels instead. Bill Fraser, unfortunately after the war, went on the downturn, was involved in criminality, and really had a sad end. The book is very, very dense. It's a very thick book. Goes into a lot of the planning and a lot of the operations, a lot of the background to what Rommel was doing, to what Monty was doing, to what Auchinleck was doing, as well as what the SAS were doing. It's a terrific book, and it's definitely an addition to the history of this most celebrated unit.